The word echoed through the courtroom like a death knell. Life. Judge Harold Pemberton delivered the sentence with the casual indifference of a man ordering lunch. His gavel came down with a sharp crack that made several people in the gallery flinch. Eloise Carter stood perfectly still at the defense table, her weathered hands clasped in front of her navy dress, the same one she wore to church every third Sunday. At 72 years old, she had buried a husband, raised 3 children, and survived more hardship than most people could imagine. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. Mrs. Carter, the judge continued, leaning back in his leather chair with unmistakable satisfaction. People like you always think you can get away with it. You prey on your community, exploit the trust of good people, and then play the innocent victim when the law catches up with you. He paused, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. Well, not in my courtroom. You'll have plenty of time to reflect on your choices. The prosecutor, a young man named Derek Hastings who looked barely old enough to rent a car, nodded along with rehearsed solemnity. The public defender assigned to Eloise, overwhelmed, underpaid, and juggling 47 other cases, simply stared at his scuffed shoes. Eloise finally spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Your Honor, may I please make one phone call before they take me away? Judge Pemberton's eyebrows rose. A smirk played at the corner of his thin lips. A phone call? Mrs. Carter, this isn't the movies. But you know what? He glanced at the bailiff with barely concealed amusement. I'm feeling generous. Make your call. Say your goodbyes. Officer Reynolds, let her use the phone right there. The bailiff, a stocky man with kind eyes that contrasted sharply with the judge's cruelty, nodded and brought a cordless phone to the defense table. The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Eloise's trembling fingers dialing a number she knew by heart. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, deep, professional. Son, Eloise said quietly, her composure finally cracking just slightly. The judge just gave me life. To understand how Eloise Carter ended up in that courtroom, you had to rewind 6 months to a different version of her life. One where she was known simply as Miss Eloise, the woman who organized the food pantry at Bethel AME Church, who knew everyone's grandchildren by name, who kept a jar of peppermints in her purse for the kids on her street. She had started a small community organization called Hope Haven, helping seniors navigate Medicare paperwork, teaching basic computer skills, connecting people with social services. It operated out of her modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, funded by small donations and the occasional grant. Everything was above board, documented meticulously in the spiral notebooks she kept in her kitchen drawer. Then the letters started arriving. Official-looking envelopes from companies she'd never heard of, thanking her for her partnership in various business ventures. Credit cards she hadn't applied for. Invoices for services she'd never authorized. When she tried to report it, she was brushed off, told it was probably just junk mail, confusion, clerical errors. The confusion turned to fear when federal agents showed up at her door one Tuesday morning, armed with a warrant. They said Hope Haven was a front for a money laundering operation, that hundreds of thousands of dollars had passed through accounts bearing her name and her organization's tax ID, that she was the mastermind behind a scheme defrauding vulnerable seniors across 3 counties. Eloise had tried to explain that she barely understood how to check her email, that someone must have stolen her identity, that she kept every receipt, every record. But the agents had evidence, bank statements, wire transfers, incorporation documents, all with her signature. Signatures that looked exactly like hers, but that she swore she'd never written. The real tragedy was that no one seemed interested in her truth. In the courtroom, Judge Pemberton had built a career on harsh sentences and tough-on-crime rhetoric. He was up for re-election next year, and conviction rates looked good on campaign mailers. From the moment Eloise's case landed on his docket, it was clear he'd already decided her fate. He interrupted her testimony repeatedly. When her public defender tried to introduce evidence of identity theft, unusual account access from IP addresses across the country, timestamps that proved Eloise was at church when transactions occurred, the judge sustained every prosecution objection. Irrelevant. Speculation. Move along, counselor. Prosecutor Hastings painted a picture of a cunning woman who used her grandmother persona as camouflage, who weaponized community trust to exploit the very people she claimed to help. He spoke about accountability and sending a message with the fervor of someone who'd never known a day of real hardship. He leaned heavily on the documentary evidence. All those signatures, all those transactions, without ever addressing the mountain of circumstantial evidence suggesting LOEs had been set up. The judge ate it up. This court will not tolerate predators who disguise themselves as caregivers, he announced during his pre-sentencing remarks, as if he were delivering a keynote address rather than determining someone's life. Mrs. Carter, you have shown no remorse, no accountability. You sit there and maintain this charade of innocence when the evidence against you is overwhelming. Eloise's public defender had whispered to her during a recess, I'm sorry. I don't think we can win this. He's made up his mind. She'd asked him what her chances were on appeal. He'd looked away before answering. Honestly, not good. Not without new evidence. Now, standing in that courtroom with the phone pressed to her ear, Eloise felt the weight of every assumption, every stereotype, every moment she'd been dismissed or ignored. The judge thought she was powerless. The prosecutor thought she was guilty. The system thought she didn't matter. They were all about to learn otherwise. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and listen to me, the voice on the phone said with unsettling composure. Tell me the judge's full name, the case number, and the prosecutor's name. I need you to say it clearly. Eloise glanced at the judge, who was checking his watch with obvious impatience. She straightened her spine and spoke clearly. Judge Harold Pemberton. Case number 2024, CR 8847. Prosecutor Derek Hastings. The judge rolled his eyes. Mrs. Carter, this is touching, but we don't have all day. Your Honor, Eloise interrupted gently. My son would like to address the court. May I put this on speaker? Pemberton actually laughed. Your son wants to address the court? Mrs. Carter, the sentencing is complete. I don't care if your son is. Assistant United States Attorney Marcus Carter, Northern District, the voice cut through the courtroom speaker as the bailiff, responding to Eloise's pleading look, had activated the speakerphone. Currently serving as Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division. Judge Pemberton, I'm going to need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. Prosecutor Hastings went pale. The court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype machine. Judge Pemberton's smirk evaporated. I'm sorry. Who did you say you were? The judge asked, his voice suddenly lacking its earlier confidence. I'll repeat myself once. Marcus said, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Carter. I've been monitoring this case from the beginning, Your Honor, and I've watched you conduct one of the most egregious travesties of justice I've seen in my 15-year career. Now wait just a minute, Pemberton started. No, Your Honor, you wait. Case number 2024, CR 8847, is directly connected to a federal investigation that's been ongoing for 8 months. My mother, yes, the woman you just sentenced to life in prison, is not a suspect. She's a victim. And you just sentenced a victim of identity theft and financial fraud to life in prison based on evidence that our forensic accountants flagged as fraudulent 4 months ago. The courtroom erupted in whispers. A reporter in the back row was already typing furiously on her phone. Prosecutor Hastings stood frozen, his face now ashen. Marcus continued, relentless. The signatures on those incorporation documents? Forged. We have handwriting analysis from 3 independent experts. The wire transfers? Initiated from accounts opened using stolen credentials. The real perpetrators are part of a criminal network that's been targeting nonprofit organizations across 5 states, using identity theft to create shell companies and launder money through legitimate community programs. My mother's organization was one of 17 that were victimized. If you had this information, why didn't you? The judge began. Why didn't we intervene sooner? Because we were building a case against the actual criminals, Your Honor. And because we expected, naively, it seems, that a state court judge would exercise basic due diligence before sentencing a 72-year-old woman with no criminal record to life in prison. Marcus's voice carried the kind of cold fury that came from absolute certainty. "But let me ask you some questions, Judge Pemberton. Did you review the chain of custody on the financial evidence? Did you question why none of the alleged transactions occurred in my mother's home county? Did you find it strange that a woman who barely uses a computer supposedly orchestrated a multi-state digital fraud scheme?" Silence. Let me also ask about the witness testimony that was excluded. The cybersecurity expert who traced the account breaches. The neighbors who documented my mother's whereabouts during the alleged criminal activity. The bank employee who tried to testify that my mother reported the fraudulent accounts. All excluded from evidence. Why is that, Your Honor? Judge Pemberton's face had turned a deep red. "Counsel, this is highly irregular. What's irregular is a judge rushing to judgment on a high-profile case in an election year," Marcus said. "What's irregular is sustaining objections to exculpatory evidence while allowing prejudicial statements from the prosecution. What's irregular is a sentencing that's completely disproportionate to the conviction, almost as if someone wanted to make an example of a convenient scapegoat." Marcus paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow more menacing. "I have agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit waiting outside that courthouse right now. I have an emergency motion for stay of sentence that was filed with the appellate court 17 minutes ago. And I have a very detailed memorandum going to the State Judicial Conduct Commission documenting every irregularity in this trial." The bailiff had moved closer to Eloise, his expression a mixture of shock and something that looked like vindication. The prosecutor had sunk into his chair. Even the court reporter looked up, her professional neutrality cracked by obvious alarm. Furthermore, Marcus continued, "The actual perpetrators of this fraud scheme were arrested this morning in a coordinated operation across 3 states. Among those arrested, a paralegal who worked in the county clerk's office with access to incorporation filings, a loan officer at Midwest Regional Bank, and, this is particularly interesting, the brother-in-law of a prominent local attorney who has donated substantially to certain judicial campaigns." Judge Pemberton stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This court is in recess. I need to consult with—" "Your Honor, this court is going to stay in session until you vacate that sentence," Marcus said. "Because if my mother is transferred to state custody under that conviction, you're going to be explaining to a federal judge tomorrow morning why you ignored evidence of innocence, why you denied her effective assistance of counsel, and why your campaign finance records show donations from individuals connected to the criminal network that framed her." The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Every eye was on the judge, whose face had cycled from red to white. He looked at the prosecutor, who deliberately avoided eye contact. He looked at his bailiff, who was now standing protectively near Eloise. He looked at the reporter in the gallery, whose fingers were flying across her phone keyboard. "Officer Reynolds," Judge Pemberton said, his voice now barely above a whisper, "release Mrs. Carter from custody. The court is granting a stay pending review of new evidence." "That's not sufficient, Your Honor," Marcus said. "Vacate the sentence. Dismiss with prejudice. My mother has already spent 6 months under this cloud. She's lost her reputation, her savings on legal fees, and her peace of mind. You're going to fix this right now, or I'm going to make sure every legal journal and news organization in this state knows exactly what happened in this courtroom today." 3 hours later, after emergency motions, hasty conferences, and the arrival of actual federal agents, all charges against Eloise Carter were dismissed. The investigation shifted to where it belonged, to the network of criminals who had exploited nonprofit organizations and framed their founders. Judge Pemberton announced he would be taking a leave of absence for health reasons. Prosecutor Hastings was reassigned, pending an internal review. Eloise walked out of that courthouse with her son's arm around her shoulders. Marcus had driven 4 hours the moment she'd been arrested, but he'd held back, building the case, gathering the evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. He'd known his mother was innocent. He'd also known that proving it would require more than just his word. It would require dismantling the entire corrupt structure that had targeted her. 2 weeks later, sitting in her kitchen on Maple Street with a cup of tea growing cold, Eloise watched the news report on her laptop. 7 people had been indicted in the nonprofit fraud scheme. The investigation had uncovered over $3 million in laundered money. And Judge Harold Pemberton was facing judicial misconduct charges that would likely end his career. Marcus sat across from her, still in his suit from work, looking exhausted but satisfied. "I'm sorry I couldn't step in sooner, Mama. I had to build it right, make it airtight." Eloise reached across the table and took her son's hand. "You saved me, baby. Not just from prison. You saved my name, my reputation. You made them see the truth. You saved yourself," Marcus corrected gently. "You kept your records. You documented everything. You stayed calm when they tried to break you. All I did was make them listen to what you've been saying all along." Within months, Eloise's case became a catalyst for change. The state legislature launched a review of cases involving elderly defendants, particularly those sentenced by judges with questionable campaign finance connections. Several other victims of the fraud scheme came forward, their own dismissed complaints suddenly taken seriously. Hope Haven reopened, now with additional safeguards and support from the state's Attorney General's office to prevent identity theft. Eloise returned to her work, feeding the hungry, helping seniors navigate bureaucracy, teaching computer classes with a new emphasis on protecting against fraud. But she carried something new now, a fierce understanding of how easily the powerless could be discarded by systems designed to protect them, and an equally fierce determination to ensure others didn't suffer the same fate. She spoke at community centers, churches, and senior facilities about her experience. She worked with Marcus's office to create educational programs about identity theft targeting nonprofits. And she testified before the state legislature about the need for judicial reform and better protection for defendants who couldn't afford adequate legal representation. The story spread far beyond her small city. News outlets picked it up. Federal prosecutor saves mother from wrongful life sentence. But that headline missed the point. The real story wasn't about a son rescuing his mother. It was about a woman who maintained her dignity in the face of systematic injustice, who trusted in the truth even when no one believed her, and who refused to be invisible even when powerful people wanted her to disappear. People underestimate quiet dignity until it's backed by truth and reinforced by someone who refuses to let that truth be buried. Eloise Carter had both, and in the end, that made all the difference. The judge had assumed she was alone, powerless, forgotten. He learned too late that she was none of those things. She was a mother who had raised a son to fight for justice. She was a woman who kept meticulous records and maintained her integrity even when it seemed pointless. She was a community member whose neighbors remembered her kindness and came forward as witnesses. She was, in short, exactly who she'd always been, someone who mattered, whether the system acknowledged it or not. And that phone call didn't just save her life. It reminded everyone in that courtroom that dignity, truth, and family aren't just abstract concepts. Sometimes they're the only things standing between justice and its counterfeit.